For more than a century, the United States government paid a German arms company royalties on one of its own most iconic military rifles, a debt that continued right up until the exact moment Germany actually became America's own enemy in the First World War, a diplomatic irony that meant American soldiers were, for years, carrying a rifle their own government was quietly still paying the future enemy to use. This is not a story about a single legendary weapon. It is the story of a single government arsenal in Massachusetts that armed American soldiers for 174 consecutive years, and the uncomfortable irony that one of its own most famous rifles was, by any honest technical measure, largely a copy of a German design. This is the story of Springfield Armory, founded by an order from George Washington himself, the institution behind the rifles that armed American soldiers from the earliest days of the Republic through Vietnam, and the specific rifle whose own patent dispute with a foreign arms maker outlasted an entire world war fought against that same country. Every week, we take apart the story stamped on the receiver of an American firearm, the founders, the soldiers, and the decisions that built a legend or lost one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Springfield Armory's own origins predate the United States Constitution itself, established as a federal arsenal in the 1790s under an order connected directly to George Washington's own administration, a decision that made Springfield the government's own dedicated facility for designing and manufacturing standard infantry weapons, rather than relying entirely on private contractors, the way many other early American military needs were met, at a time when the young nation's own industrial capacity remained genuinely limited. Over the following century, the Armory produced a succession of increasingly modern rifles as battlefield technology evolved at a pace few institutions anywhere in the world were managing to keep pace with, moving from muzzle-loading muskets through the breech-loading Trapdoor Springfield that armed American soldiers across the Indian Wars and into the 1890s, a rifle this channel has already covered, as part of a broader look at the weapons that actually shaped the American frontier. During exactly the same decades, the Armory itself was steadily refining its own manufacturing capabilities. The Armory's most consequential and most quietly controversial design arrived at the turn of the 20th century, born directly out of a humiliating lesson American forces learned fighting an entirely different army on foreign soil. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, American troops armed with the Krag-Jorgensen rifle, itself a Springfield Armory design, only recently adopted after considerable internal debate over its own single locking lug design and comparatively slow loading system, found themselves consistently outmatched by Spanish soldiers carrying German-made Mauser rifles, weapons that reloaded faster and fired a more powerful cartridge than anything American forces carried into the same engagements against a numerically much smaller opponent. At the Battle of San Juan Heights and again at El Caney, American commanders watched comparatively small Spanish forces, armed with Mausers, hold off considerably larger American units for hours. A tactical humiliation serious enough that at El Caney specifically, a Spanish force of roughly 540 regulars held off an American division of more than 6,600 soldiers for the better part of an entire day, delaying reinforcements badly needed elsewhere on the same battlefield. A resulting official Army Board of Investigation recommended the Krag's own replacement almost immediately once the full scale of the tactical disadvantage had become impossible to ignore any longer. Before we get into how that investigation actually produced America's own most famous bolt-action rifle, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Springfield Armory's own engineers responded by designing a new rifle so closely modeled on the Mauser system that Germany's own Mauser company eventually filed a formal patent infringement lawsuit against the United States government and won a genuine legal victory over the world's most powerful military, a case that dragged through American courts for years while the rifle itself remained in full production and active military service, regardless of the unresolved legal dispute hanging over its own basic design. The resulting design, officially adopted in 1903 and known ever since simply as the Springfield 03 incorporated design elements Mauser's own engineers had specifically patented years earlier, differences the American design attempted to work around by using a two-piece firing pin, a modification Springfield's own engineers hoped would prove legally distinct enough to avoid liability, but that ultimately proved insufficient once the case was formally reviewed by American courts. The United States government agreed to pay Mauser royalties of 75 cents per rifle and 50 cents per thousand ammunition clips, continuing those payments for years until they totaled roughly $200,000, with the final installment made in July of 1909, a full 8 years before the debt's own diplomatic circumstances changed entirely. The United States was paying royalties to a future enemy. A second German firm brought forward a separate infringement claim in 1907 over the ammunition itself, a claim the American government outright denied. And when the United States formally entered the First World War against Germany in 1917, that remaining lawsuit was simply thrown out and the underlying patents seized as enemy property, ending a debt the American government had spent more than a decade quietly honoring, right up until the exact moment paying it any further became not just inconvenient but legally impossible, a legal and diplomatic irony that meant America had spent the better part of a decade paying the same nation it would eventually fight a world war against for the privilege of using that nation's own rifle design in the first place. President Theodore Roosevelt himself, a man this channel has already covered for his own attachment to a considerably different Winchester rifle he carried on safari, took a personal interest in the new Springfield's own early flaws, writing directly to the Secretary of War shortly after the rifle's adoption to complain specifically about its original rod-style bayonet, a thin, fragile attachment Roosevelt bluntly described as about as poor an invention as he had ever personally encountered. Criticism delivered with the kind of blunt, hands-on authority few sitting presidents before or since have brought to a firearms procurement dispute. That criticism, from a president with genuine first-hand hunting and shooting experience, rather than merely a political interest in military procurement, decisions made largely by career bureaucrats, contributed directly to the bayonet's own early replacement with a more conventional blade design before the rifle ever saw large-scale combat use overseas, a rare instance of a president's own personal firearms expertise directly shaping a standing military procurement decision. The Springfield 03 went on to serve as the primary American infantry rifle through the First World War, though wartime demand for the weapon eventually outpaced what Springfield Armory and a second government facility at Rock Island Arsenal could actually produce between them, even working at full wartime capacity, forcing the Army to supplement its own rifle with an American-manufactured variant of a British pattern design built under license by Winchester and Remington, a rifle known as the M1917 that ultimately equipped more American doughboys in France than the Springfield itself did, despite the Springfield's own considerably greater fame in the decades since the war actually ended. Military politics and institutional preference for the government's own design ensured the Springfield 03 remained the officially preferred standard rifle after the war ended, regardless of the M1917's own considerably larger wartime production numbers, a preference for the government arsenal's own product over private contractors that would echo through several subsequent decades of Springfield's own institutional history and internal culture. Springfield Armory's own most famous chapter arrived a generation later with the M1 Garand, a rifle and a designer this channel has already covered in considerable detail, the first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle any major army fielded in large numbers during the Second World War, replacing the bolt-action Springfield 03 as the standard American infantry weapon, and cementing the Armory's own reputation as the single most important rifle design facility in the entire United States government at exactly the moment that reputation mattered most on a genuinely global military stage. The Armory's own institutional responsibilities expanded further still during and after the Second World War to include managing production and parts support for the M1 carbine, a lighter companion weapon this channel has also already covered in its own right, extending Springfield's own direct institutional involvement across nearly every major American service rifle of the mid-20th century, simultaneously a period during which the Armory's own name became functionally synonymous within military and collecting circles alike with authoritative, government-backed rifle design rather than any single specific weapon. That 174-year run of continuous government rifle production ended not with any single dramatic failure, but with a straightforward, unsentimental, budgetary decision made far from any battlefield. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara closed Springfield Armory in 1968, part of a broader Defense Department cost-cutting initiative that judged a dedicated government-owned design and manufacturing facility less efficient than relying on private contractors for the country's own future small arms needs. Going forward into an increasingly different kind of defense procurement environment, a rationale considerably less romantic than the institution's own long, storied history might have led observers to expect for its actual ending after nearly 2 centuries of continuous operation. The decision drew genuine criticism from veterans and collectors who viewed the closure as the loss of an irreplaceable institutional knowledge base built up across generations of dedicated government engineers. Criticism that did little to reverse a decision already made on purely financial grounds by officials considerably more focused on the department's own broader budget than any single facility's own historical significance. The rifle's own ammunition underwent its own quiet evolution alongside these institutional dramas, a detail easily overlooked next to the more dramatic patent lawsuit, but genuinely consequential to the weapon's own lasting performance reputation. The original .30-03 cartridge, adopted alongside the rifle itself in 1903, proved less effective than European rivals already fielding lighter, more aerodynamic, Spitzer-style bullets, and Springfield's own ordnance engineers revised the cartridge in 1906 into what became known as the .30-06, a designation that simply recorded its own year of adoption in the same straightforward institutional style the Armory itself was named for. That cartridge went on to become one of the most widely used rifle rounds in American history, chambered eventually in the Garand itself decades later, and remaining a standard hunting cartridge for civilian shooters long after the Springfield '03 that had originally introduced it had been retired from active military service entirely. This is not a story about a single legendary weapon carrying an entire national reputation on its own, since Springfield Armory's own actual legacy rests considerably more on institutional continuity than on any one rifle's individual fame across a period of nearly 2 centuries. It is a story about a single government facility that quietly designed and built the primary weapon American soldiers carried into nearly every major conflict from the earliest days of the Republic through the middle of the 20th century, an institution whose own most famous individual product turned out to be, on close inspection, largely a licensed copy of a foreign design the United States government spent more than a decade paying for before circumstances simply made the debt convenient to abandon once that same foreign nation became the enemy. The name itself outlived the actual institution by a considerable margin, a detail that continues to cause genuine confusion among casual observers unfamiliar with the Armory's own 1968 closure. A private company unrelated to the original government arsenal later adopted the Springfield Armory name commercially, manufacturing firearms under that same historic name for civilian and law enforcement markets decades after the original government facility itself had already closed its own doors permanently, a commercial continuation that trades on the original institution's own considerable reputation without any direct organizational connection to the actual government engineers and machinists who built that reputation across nearly 2 centuries of continuous service to the country. Visitors to the actual historic site in Massachusetts today walk through buildings where generations of government engineers solved exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous problems, patent disputes, bayonet complaints, wartime production shortfalls that rarely make it into the popular mythology surrounding any single famous rifle, but that collectively explain why American soldiers carried Springfield-made weapons into nearly every major conflict fought between the founding of the Republic and the escalation of the war in Vietnam. Springfield Armory's own institutional identity extended beyond simple mass production into a genuine tradition of precision marksmanship as well, a quieter but equally significant part of its own legacy. The Armory produced specialized national match variants of its own service rifles, specifically for competitive shooting, precision-built examples that let American service members and civilian competitors alike compete in national marksmanship competitions using rifles built to noticeably tighter tolerances than standard-issue examples, a program that helps cement the Armory's own reputation among serious shooters as a source of genuine precision engineering rather than merely mass-produced military hardware built purely for durability and cost efficiency. Today, the original Springfield Armory site operates as a national historic site, preserving the buildings and machinery behind more than a century and a half of American rifle production for visitors who mostly associate the Springfield name with a single famous bolt-action rifle rather than the considerably longer, considerably more complicated institutional history that name actually represents. If you want more stories about the institutions behind the rifles, rather than just the rifles themselves, subscribe, and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.